Good morning. This is Sonia from An Enthusiastic Reader. Without much ado, I am going to present the best books I read in 2022. I have both a backlist and new release sections of my review, and I'm not going to talk about the books too much. In order to keep this video a reasonable length, I have talked about them many times in previous videos. I may say a little something here or there, but let's just get to the list. Here is the backlist. I read Jane Austen, A Life by Carol Shields. This was a very slim biography of Jane Austen, written by Carol Shields, who is one of my all-time favorite novelists, who has sadly died years ago of breast cancer. But I thought that the observations that Carol Shields made about Jane Austen's writing, what you could or couldn't know from the historical record, and just making some suppositions and also using some literary criticism to just kind of put together this portrait of a life of disappointments and isolation many times, and being the daughter that didn't get married and having your life very limited by your circumstance, as we've seen in so many of Austen's novels. And it was just like a perfect gem of a biography if you wanted to know more about Jane Austen without reading Claire Tomlinson's tome about it. So I really enjoyed this. The second is the Balkan Trilogy by Olivia Manning. This series of 3 novels follows a married couple. They just barely married. They married kind of on a whim, and off they are swept to Bucharest, where the husband, Guy, is going to be teaching English for the British. And so he's employed by the British government, and so their fates are tied to whatever's happening at the beginning of the war. This is in 1939, and war chases them from place to place to place, and you meet all these other very colorful characters along the way, and there is a lot of emotion and humor, what life might be like for people who are in the midst of the chaos of World War II, Central and Eastern Europe. There are so many great things about this, and now I am reading with the group the Levant Trilogy, which is the follow-up next 3 novels about the same couple and their time in another country. I won't spoil it in case you want to read it. Next, we have Milkman by Anna Burns. I loved this first-person narrative of a young woman who lives in Northern Ireland I think in the 80s during the Troubles, and the way that language is used by the author to create a feeling of paranoia and of keeping all of your thoughts to yourself so that you don't get killed because of your thoughts. And the main character wanders around reading novels in the road, and that creates a lot of fear amongst people, wondering, what she's thinking about, and kind of alienating her from the community because she's so secretive. And she is being pursued by a hitman, romantically, and it is very disturbing. She has her own boyfriend, and there is a lurking sense of violence and dread in the community. And yeah, it was fantastic. Another backlisted series of novels that I've talked about in several other videos, so I won't talk about it too much here, is the Regeneration Trilogy by Pat Barker, and this follows World War I soldiers who have been hospitalized. There's a lot more to it than this, but they've been hospitalized for shell shock, essentially, and it is up to the psychiatrist to get them prepared to send them back to battle. And so there are a mix of real life characters and also some fictional characters who are patients. The psychiatrist, Dr. Rivers, is based on a real character in life, and the World War I poets, including Siegfried Sassoon, are some of the historical persons that are in this. But this whole series, the series as a whole, is fantastic. I will definitely be revisiting these books sometime in the future. Right now we are going to get to the 2022 releases, and there are a lot more of these that I have to talk about that were my best and favorite books of 2022. I am not going to rate these, so this is in no particular order of preference. These are all books I liked these are all books I liked and that I remember and that I think will stick with me for a long time. The first one is The Sentence by Louise Erdrich. This is essentially a COVID novel set in Minneapolis during the George Floyd protests. But it's about COVID, it's about George Floyd, it's about Indigenous people and their rights being abrogated all the time, and violence on all ends of their existence. And also it's funny. It's set in a bookstore. She talks so much about books. The main character is fantastic. And she's got a very, she is emotional. She read a lot of books while she was in prison. And so she talks a lot about that experience. And at the very end, she has a reading list of recommended books. And I just can't say enough about this. This was so good. Louise Erdrich is one of my favorite authors of all time. I still haven't read many of her novels, and it's my lifelong ambition to read all of her books, maybe more than once. Next, we have Night of the Living Res by Morgan Talty, and this is a book of interconnected short stories about Indigenous people in Maine. It's coastal Maine, and it's all about their traumas and family dynamics and poverty, and there's just so much to it. Addiction, there's the whole gamut of the human experience is in these connected short stories, which are not chronological. They go back and forth between when the main character was a young boy and then to when he is a young man and then an older man. So there's a whole timeline, and the stories of his family are revealed slowly through these stories and not in chronological order. But I can't wait to see what more Morgan Talty writes in the future. All right, next we have a book of essays called Run Towards the Danger by Sarah Polley. Sarah is a director. She was a child actor. She is a playwright, and she's an activist. She is just a remarkable person. And so these essays are all about moments in her life when she was in some kind of peril, either emotional or physical peril. And for instance, the first essay in the collection is a really long essay, but it's all about when she was a child actor, and her mother dies, and she's left with her father, who is very much wrapped up into his own emotional mess, and he is a very neglectful and not great father at all to her. And he says inappropriate things to her, and he is obsessed with Alice in Wonderland and Lewis Carroll and his attraction to girls, and says weird things to Sarah. And then Sarah is cast in the play of Alice in Wonderland, so she has to be Alice. So I mean, there is a lot going on here, and she develops a case of stage fright. So that's what that essay is about. But the way that she writes it is just, the writing is fantastic. So, and every essay to me was equally as good, all about different points in her life where things were happening. There's a traumatic brain injury when a fire extinguisher falls on her head, and what it took to overcome that traumatic brain injury after trying literally everything to kind of come out of that. It totally stopped her life and put her in just this holding pattern. And it was really inspiring. So I love her, and I think that this would be a great book club book. Next, we have Elena Knows by Claudia Pineiro, and this is translated from the Spanish. It's an Argentinian novella, basically, about a main character who is elderly, or she's much older, and she is in the later stages of Parkinson's disease, and her daughter dies. And the main character is convinced that her daughter has been murdered. And she decides to make a trek across the city via public transportation to find a woman that knew both she and her daughter, and try and find out if this person would help her try and find out what happened to her daughter. And so that's the skeleton of the story. Most of it is that she takes medication for her Parkinson's, and she has limited mobility, and she has to do everything physical that she can during the moments when the medication is working. And so how she, she's bent over at the waist, how she is able to walk, how other people perceive her as her body is bent over, and who ignores her and who tries to help her, and all the things that are going through her mind. And it is fantastic. So it's such a good depiction of what happens to people who are not fully mobile and have to figure out how to still live in a world that really isn't built for them in that state. I talked about this novel at the beginning of 2022. It's called The Dickens Boy by Thomas Kenneally. Kenneally is an Australian author and novelist. He's famous. He wrote Schindler's List, but he's incredibly prolific and has written many, many historical novels about various time periods in Australian or New Zealand history. And this novel was so funny. It's based on real people. It's about Charles Dickens's son, and his nickname is Plorn, Plorn, and his father sends he and a couple of his other brothers off to Australia to make their fortunes in sheep herding. But this boy, he's like 17 years old, maybe 18, and so he's still, a very young man. And this is a coming of age novel, also a fish out of water story where he travels and he has the wit and tender heart of a Dickensian character, and he's just trying to figure out life, and he is kind of mad at his dad, and he has never read any of Charles Dickens's work, and Dickens is a massively famous man across the world. And so people are always coming up to this character and saying, "Oh, this was my favorite novel. Did you like it?" And he has to pretend that he's read these novels because he doesn't want to read his father's novels. And it made me laugh. What it does is it also talks a lot about how British colonialism jarred and upended and uprooted people who had been in Australia for thousands of years in their own culture, and what colonialism and the sheep herding did to those people's communities and their whole identity. So it's not just about a lighthearted story about Dickens and son, but it's also about other things, and I highly recommend. Next, you won't be surprised by this, but Lucy by the Sea by Elizabeth Strout. This is the 4th novel in the Omgosh series. I have talked about this so much on my channel, and I know a lot of other people really liked this too. It's a COVID novel where Lucy's first husband, who she's divorced from, decides to whisk her away from New York City because he knows that the pandemic is going to be much worse than they're letting on at the beginning. He is an epidemic. I can't remember. He is in scientific research. So he knows what's happening. And she is a bit in denial, and it's a first-person story. So Lucy is telling her story and recounting what happened when William said, "I want to save your life," and takes her to the coast of Maine, to kind of the same area where Olive Kittredge is from. This is not an Olive Kittredge story at all, so don't think that, but it's just some of the same universe. And Bob Burgess, who is a character from the Burgess Boys, is also in the book. And it captures so much about, and it reminds you of the way that the first part of COVID was for all of us, just being completely disoriented, and the political divide that comes from the entire situation about masking, not masking, vaccines, not vaccines, and the tribalism that blooms out of that as well. I'm just making my pitch for reading Elizabeth Strout. This is a long list, you guys. Okay. Next, we have The Colony by Audrey Magee. This is a recent read for me. This was a story set on an island off the coast of Ireland, and it is about intruders coming from a linguist and a painter using up some of the resources of the island and paying to be there for experience. The linguist is studying the language and its disappearance and the infiltration of English into the Irish language, and the painter says he wants to come and paint the cliffs and the birds of the island, but really wants to, or ends up kind of intruding upon the people and using his talent to paint them when he was told that's not why he was supposed to be there. And he forms a mentorship with a young artist on the island, and it causes a lot of trouble. Literally. It's set in the 80s, and so interspersed in the chapters with the characters on the island, there are accounts of all of the political violence and the brutal murders that are happening back and forth between them. So there's the reality of the real life situation interspersed with what's happening with all the people in the summer on the island. And it was really very good. Next, we have Lessons by Ian McEwan. This is a divisive novel because a lot of people don't think that it was, I don't even know how to describe what the conflict is, except for that I think people don't like Ian McEwan. But I thought it was really good. It was a very good accounting of one man's life from the mid-40s when he was born and up to the current day, and his entire life, which I love books about somebody's life. And it's about something that happened to him when he was a boy with a piano teacher that kind of set him off on a path, the wrong path, and emotionally scarred him in a sense, and skewed all of his relationships with women after that it happened. If you like a long saga about a man and his life, and he's not particularly remarkable, he doesn't have a talent, but he ends up being a good person, which I think is worth reading about. Next, we have Fellowship Point by Alice Elliott Dark. This is another long generational saga, mostly focusing on two 80-year-old women that vacation in Maine. I had a thing about reading books in Maine, that their great-grandfather or great-great-grandfathers created this land trust, and they're Quakers. The people all, started out as Quakers and have this land trust where they built these homes and with summer. And most of the people were from Philadelphia, and so they would winter in Philadelphia, summer in Maine. And this book is about these 80-year-old women who are best friends. One is married, one is not. And the woman who is not married, Agnes Lee, is a writer. And so she's kind of famous for writing this series of books about a girl, and so they're children's books. But she's also secretly a novelist, and nobody knows that she is the writer of a whole series of novels about women from the Philadelphia neighborhood where she grew up. And no one knows, and they're popular books, but no one, not even her best friend, knows that she's writing these novels. I love books about writers. I want to read you an excerpt. I'm not reading excerpts of any of the other books, but in order to kind of give you an idea of what Agnes Lee's philosophy of writing is, and this kind of observation that is made in the book is kind of, for me, what sets it apart from just like a commercial fiction novel about someone. Like it goes into a deeper understanding of the character. And so I'm going to read this. I'm going to be looking at my computer screen because I have it all set up there. So they're talking about Agnes Lee. Her other series, the Franklin Square novels, were popular and over time critically praised. She'd written the first one at age 24, mainly as a way to inoculate herself from succumbing to the fates of her friends, reconfigured as the Franklin Square girls as they married or got jobs. It galled her to see them make themselves smaller in order to fit into the roles available to them. Their talents were subsumed into utility and support. She wanted to show things as they were in great detail, to the end of portraying the absurdity of the setup, even for women who had advantages. In her experience, it was harder for girls who'd grown up as she had to notice exactly when they'd been conscripted into the power structure. It was all so seamless and nice. She had been in danger of it herself, her father being kind and on her side, but she'd noticed from the earliest age the hierarchies that existed in every gathering of people, and she'd had a clear, visceral objection. It was her subject in many variations and permutations. She didn't moralize, preach, or conclude. The project of fiction was, in essence, dramatic, and sought to reveal what a particular person was bound to do under explicit circumstances. It was hard to figure that out, but when she was able to do so, when after she'd thrown out dozens of false attempts, she suddenly saw exactly how her girls would act and react. When she was able to make her plots ring the clear bell of inevitability, she'd fulfilled her end of the contract as a writer and left it to the reader to discover the meaning. She was absolutely sure of her opinions and her worldview and trusted that they were conveyed palatably in engrossing plots so that she didn't have to spell out her positions. She was a novelist. No one knew. So I love that idea of the author, any author, just like clearly constructing the fiction to elucidate a worldview. And whether you agree with it or not, that's neither here nor there, but it gives you something, like it just creates a world that you can enter into or you can choose to leave. And so that was just one like little gem. That the whole book, it's very long, but they're just full of gems about psychology of human beings and the way we treat each other and the nature of friendships. And yes, these people are very privileged, but that is confronted too. So I thought it was so good and no one's read it. Okay, my final best book of 2022 is a book of short stories. They are not connected short stories, but they are thematic. They are all about adults whose children have either grown up or childless people who are married in Ireland during COVID. So it's called Life Without Children by Roddy Doyle. Roddy Doyle is an Irish novelist and short story writer. He writes very, very funny and also very poignant stories. And I've been reading him on and off for my entire adulthood. And I didn't know if I wanted to read a book of short stories about COVID, but it turns out I did. I really enjoyed it. I listened to the audio version, and Roddy Doyle was his own narrator, so and he is a fabulous reader of his own work, which is not always the case with authors. They're not always very good at reading their own work, but he is. He had all the intonations, the right mood, so it was a very successful audiobook for me. So it's about the isolation of COVID and also about if they do have children, trying to keep in touch with them, or what it was like to binge TV shows and have midlife crises and crises in marriage and breakups and reconciliations. It was really great. So guess what? That's it. I'm 30 minutes into this. And I just want to say thank you so much for watching. Let me know what your favorite novel was if you would like to in the comments, and I look forward to seeing you very soon. Bye.